Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the September 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Chapter 26 of Marx's Capital, Volume 1 from 1867. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So, Chapter 26 is titled The Secret of Primitive Accumulation, and it's the first of 8 chapters in Part 8 of 8 of Capital Volume 1. Part 8 is called Primitive Accumulation, and what this whole section deals with is how capitalism came to be. Basically, this chapter is kind of an introduction to this part, and to take a choice quote from this chapter, quote, "The so-called primitive accumulation, therefore, is nothing else than the historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production. It appears as primitive because it forms the prehistoric stage of capital and of the mode of production corresponding with it," unquote. So basically, we're talking about how did capitalism come about? How did the previous mode of production, feudalism, break down in such a way that the capitalist order rose to take its place? Without further ado, let's begin Chapter 26, The Secret of Primitive Accumulation. We have seen how money is changed into capital, how through capital surplus value is made, and from surplus value, more capital. But the accumulation of capital presupposes surplus value. Surplus value presupposes capitalistic production. Capitalistic production presupposes the pre-existence of considerable masses of capital and of labor power in the hands of producers of commodities. The whole movement, therefore, seems to turn in a vicious circle, out of which we can only get by supposing a primitive accumulation, the previous accumulation of Adam Smith, preceding capitalistic accumulation. An accumulation not the result of the capitalistic mode of production, but its starting point. This primitive accumulation plays in political economy about the same part as original sin in theology. Adam bit the apple, and thereupon sin fell on the human race. Its origin is supposed to be explained when it is told as an anecdote of the past. In times long gone by, there were 2 sorts of people. One, the diligent, intelligent, and above all, frugal elite. The other, lazy rascals, spending their substance and more in riotous living. The legend of the theological original sin tells us certainly how man came to be condemned to eat his bread in the sweat of his brow, but the history of economic original sin reveals to us that there are people to whom this is by no means essential. Never mind. Thus it came to pass that the former sort accumulated wealth, and the latter sort had at last nothing to sell except their own skins. And from this original sin dates the poverty of the great majority that, despite all its labor, has up to now nothing to sell but itself, and the wealth of the few that increases constantly although they have long ceased to work. Such insipid childishness is every day preached to us in the defense of property. Monsieur Thiers, for example, had the assurance to repeat it with all the solemnity of a statesman to the French people, once so spiritual. But as soon as the question of property crops up, it becomes a sacred duty to proclaim the intellectual food of the infant as the one thing fit for all ages and for all stages of development. In actual history, it is notorious that conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, briefly, force play the great part. In the tender annals of political economy, the idyllic reigns from time immemorial. Right and labor were from all time the sole means of enrichment, the present year, of course, always excepted. As a matter of fact, the methods of primitive accumulation are anything but idyllic. In themselves, money and commodities are no more capital than are the means of production and of subsistence. They want transforming into capital. But this transformation itself can only take place under certain circumstances that center in this, viz. That 2 very different kinds of commodity possessors must come face to face and into contact. On the one hand, the owners of money, means of production, means of subsistence, who are eager to increase the sum of values they possess by buying other people's labor power. On the other hand, free laborers, the sellers of their own labor power, and therefore the sellers of labor. Free laborers, in the double sense that neither they themselves form part and parcel of the means of production, as in the case of slaves, bondsmen, etc., nor do the means of production belong to them, as in the case of peasant proprietors. They are therefore free from, unencumbered by, any means of production of their own. With this polarization of the market for commodities, the fundamental conditions of capitalist production are given. The capitalist system presupposes the complete separation of the laborers from all property in the means by which they can realize their labor. As soon as capitalist production is once on its own legs, it not only maintains this separation, but reproduces it on a continually extending scale. The process, therefore, that clears the way for the capitalist system can be none other than the process which takes away from the laborer the possession of their means of production. A process that transforms, on the one hand, the social means of subsistence and of production into capital, on the other, the immediate producers into wage laborers. The so-called primitive accumulation, therefore, is nothing else than the historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production. It appears as primitive because it forms the prehistoric stage of capital, and of the mode of production corresponding with it. The economic structure of capitalist society has grown out of the economic structure of feudal society. The dissolution of the latter set free the elements of the former. The immediate producer, the laborer, could only dispose of their own person after they had ceased to be attached to the soil and ceased to be the slave, serf, or bondsman of another. To become a free seller of labor power, who carries their commodity wherever they find a market, they must further have escaped from the regime of the guilds, their rules for apprenticeships and journeymen, and the impediments of their labor regulations. Hence, the historical movement, which changes the producers into wage workers, appears on the one hand as their emancipation from serfdom and from the fetters of the guilds, and this side alone exists for our bourgeois historians. But, on the other hand, these new freedmen became sellers of themselves only after they had been robbed of all their own means of production, and of all the guarantees of existence afforded by the old feudal arrangements. And the history of this, their expropriation, is written in the annals of mankind in letters of blood and fire. The industrial capitalists, these new potentates, had on their part not only to displace the guild masters of handicrafts, but also the feudal lords, the possessors of the sources of wealth. In this respect, their conquest of social power appears as the fruit of a victorious struggle both against feudal lordship and its revolting prerogatives, and against the guilds and the fetters they laid on the free development of production and the free exploitation of man by man. The captains of industry, however, only succeeded in supplanting the captains of the sword by making use of events of which they themselves were wholly innocent. They have risen by means as vile as those by which the Roman freedman, once on a time, made himself the master of his patronus. The starting point of the development that gave rise to the wage laborer, as well as to the capitalist, was the servitude of the laborer. The advance consisted in a change of form of the servitude, in the transformation of feudal exploitation into capitalist exploitation. To understand its march, we need not go back very far. Although we come across the first beginnings of capitalist production, as early as the 14th or 15th century, sporadically in certain towns of the Mediterranean, the capitalistic era dates from the 16th century. Wherever it appears, the abolition of serfdom has long been effected, and the highest development of the Middle Ages, the existence of sovereign towns, has long been on the wane. In the history of primitive accumulation, all revolutions are epoch-making that act as levers for the capital class in the course of their formation, but above all, those moments when great masses of men are suddenly and forcibly torn from their means of subsistence and hurled as free and, quote, unattached proletarians on the labor market. The expropriation of the agricultural producer, of the peasant, from the soil, is the basis of the whole process. The history of this expropriation in different countries assumes different aspects and runs through its various phases in different orders of succession and at different periods. In England alone, which we take as our example, has it the classic form. Footnote, in Italy, where capitalistic production developed earliest, the dissolution of serfdom also took place earlier than elsewhere. The serf was emancipated in that country before they had acquired any prescriptive right to the soil. Their emancipation at once transformed them into a free proletarian, who moreover found their master ready waiting for them in the towns, for the most part handed down as legacies from the Roman time. When the revolution of the world market, about the end of the 15th century, annihilated northern Italy's commercial supremacy, a movement in the reverse direction set in. The laborers of the towns were driven en masse into the country, and gave an impulse never before seen to the petite culture, carried on in the form of gardening. And that's the end of Chapter 26. Like I said, an introduction to Part 8 of 8. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we will continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening. And thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Every donation's encouraging, they're also materially helpful, and allow me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I'd be able to do without them. So thank you very much for that vital support on this listener-supported channel. We don't run ads on this channel, so if you like this channel, thank me, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter, and consider becoming one yourself. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment, even if it's just for the algorithm. And remember, we can agitate and educate online to a fair extent, but the organizing, the third part of that slogan, happens in real life, so make sure to take what you've learned here into your offline political activity on organizing. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.